The machine ran 180 feet long and weighed roughly 670,000 pounds. It was built to crawl across the high desert of Nevada with no one aboard, carrying a single nuclear missile from one buried shelter to the next, setting a decoy down in one spot and hiding the real weapon in another, so that a Soviet camera passing overhead could never be certain which shelter to aim at. The plan called for 200 of these missiles and 4,600 shelters scattered across Nevada and Utah. The Air Force priced the system at roughly $33 billion. What follows is the record of how the money you paid to keep the country safe went looking for somewhere to hide a missile. The problem with standing still. By the late 1970s, the Air Force had talked itself into an uncomfortable piece of arithmetic. For 20 years, the country had trusted a simple idea: bury the missiles in hardened concrete silos, spread them across the northern plains, and dare any enemy to knock them all out at once. The silos sat at fixed, known addresses. That had never been a worry, because no attacker could place a warhead accurately enough to destroy a missile sealed in reinforced concrete. That comfort began to slip. Soviet missiles were growing more accurate with each new generation. The estimates circulating inside the Pentagon held that within a few years, the Soviet Union might be able to destroy the entire American land-based missile force in one coordinated strike, catching the missiles in their silos before a single one could fly. A weapon that cannot survive the first blow cannot deter a second. The whole logic of the nuclear standoff rested on an enemy believing that any attack would be answered in kind, and a missile parked at a known address was starting to look like a missile waiting to be lost. Strategists gave the danger a name. They called it the window of vulnerability, a stretch of years in which the land-based missiles might be exposed to a disarming Soviet strike. Whether that window was real or overstated would be argued for a long time. What mattered in the late 1970s was that the men planning the force believed in it, and they were not willing to leave 200 brand new missiles sitting in the open. So the planners went looking for a way to make the missile hard to find. The idea that took hold among them was movement. If a missile could not be kept safe by sitting in one fortified place, perhaps it could be kept safe by never staying in one place long enough to be targeted. Keep it shuffling among many possible hiding spots, the reasoning ran, and an attacker would have to strike every spot at once just to be sure of the one that counted. The search for a hiding place had been running for years before it turned urgent. The Air Force and its advisory boards had worked through dozens of possible ways to base the missile. By some counts, nearly 40 of them. A few were studied in earnest, and a few bordered on the fantastic, including keeping the missiles aloft on aircraft for long stretches and sealing them in deep underground tunnels that a digging machine would claw open after an attack. Every one of them was an attempt to answer the same riddle: how to keep a fixed, enormous, costly weapon from sitting still as a fixed, enormous, costly target. The missile at the center of all this was the largest the country had ever drawn up. It carried the flat working name MX, short for Missile Experimental. It would stand about 70 feet tall, carry 10 warheads, and reach farther and strike harder than anything already in the arsenal. President Carter authorized full-scale development of the MX in June of 1979. The missile itself came together without much trouble, and its components passed their early tests on schedule. The question that would swallow the next several years was a question of real estate. Where do you put 200 of the most powerful missiles ever built so that an enemy cannot find them, reach them, or be sure of destroying them? The Air Force had a candidate answer ready. The one it settled on would become one of the most elaborate construction proposals the Pentagon ever committed to paper. The desert shell game, On September 7th, 1979, the plan came off the drawing board and onto the record. President Carter announced the basing method the Air Force had settled on. It carried a bureaucratic name that gave away nothing about how strange it was: multiple protective shelter basing. The Air Force would build 4,600 shelters across the high desert of Nevada and Utah. It would buy 200 MX missiles. Each missile would be assigned to its own cluster of 23 shelters, linked by a private road about 15 miles around, an oval the planners called a racetrack. The shelters along each racetrack would sit at least 7,000 feet apart, spaced far enough that a single Soviet warhead could wreck only one shelter at a time. This is the point where the design earned its nickname. Only one of the 23 shelters on a racetrack would hold a real missile. The other 22 would hold decoys, dummy canisters built to look exactly like the genuine article from high above. The real missile would not stay put. It would be moved from shelter to shelter on a schedule, sealed behind heavy blast doors, while decoys shifted around it, so that a Soviet analyst poring over satellite photographs could never mark which of the 23 shelters held the weapon. To be sure of destroying one missile, the Soviet Union would have to spend 23 warheads, one on every shelter, and then repeat that across all 200 racetracks. The arithmetic was meant to make an attack so costly that no sensible enemy would ever try it. The newspapers found a shorter description. They called the whole thing a shell game. The shuffling required a machine, and the machine was something to see. Each missile would ride on a transporter, a vehicle about 180 feet long and weighing some 670,000 pounds, designed to move by remote control with no crew on board. It would lift the missile, haul it down the racetrack road at around 30 miles an hour, and lower it into the next shelter, or set down a decoy and roll on. If the order ever came, the transporter could launch the missile straight from the open road. After a decade of burying its missiles deeper and deeper underground, the country had arrived at an answer to vulnerability that amounted to a remote-controlled hauler the length of a city block, carrying a hydrogen bomb in slow circles around the desert. The decoys could not be crewed stand-ins. To fool a camera in orbit, every empty shelter had to match the real one in each detail a satellite might catch. The same dimensions, the same heat, the same comings and goings of vehicles and crews. The transporter would visit loaded and empty shelters alike on no schedule an analyst could read. Building 4,600 shelters and then sustaining the elaborate pretense that any one of them might hold the missile was itself a construction and logistics effort with few rivals in the history of public works. The plan carried a contradiction at its very center. To satisfy the arms control talks with Moscow, the system had to let the Soviets confirm that only 200 missiles existed among all those shelters, so the count stayed inside the limits both sides had negotiated. To survive a first strike, that same system had to keep the Soviets from ever learning which of the 4,600 shelters those 200 missiles were sitting in. The Air Force was being asked to prove a number and conceal it at the same time to the same observer, using the same shelters. The entire towering plan balanced on one assumption, an assumption written into every briefing the Air Force produced. The enemy must never learn which shelter held the missile. Keeping that secret had a formal name, location uncertainty, and it had to hold up perfectly, every hour of every day. If the Soviets ever found a way to tell a loaded shelter from an empty one, by the heat it gave off, by the wear on its access road, by any careless pattern in how the crews worked, the whole scheme would be worth no more than the 4,600 fixed targets it was built from. Holding that secret across 50,000 square miles of open desert, with thousands of workers and maintenance crews moving among the shelters every day, was a problem nobody had fully solved when the plan was announced. There was something almost theatrical in the whole arrangement, the survival of the country staked on whether a watching enemy could be kept guessing continuously for as long as the missiles stood watch. What the plan would cost, in dollars and in land, was the question the country had to face next. When the numbers arrived, they were large enough to unsettle even the people who wanted the system built. The bill and the basin. The Air Force put the cost of the shelter system at roughly $33 billion, measured in 1980 dollars. That figure by itself would have ranked it among the most expensive military projects the nation had ever taken on. The difficulty was that the $33 billion estimate leaned on the same fragile premise as everything else in the plan. It assumed the Soviet Union would hold still and not simply build more warheads. The Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan agency that prices federal programs for Congress, tested that premise and did not care for the result. If the Soviets answered 4,600 shelters by building enough fresh warheads to cover every one of them, the United States would have to build still more shelters to keep its missiles hidden, which would invite still more Soviet warheads in turn. The Budget Office calculated that a version of the system large enough to actually guarantee survival could climb as high as $106 billion. 2 years later, when President Reagan moved against the plan, he described the cost of the basing schemes as $40 to $50 billion. No one could put a single firm number on it, because the true cost depended on a Soviet response that no one could predict. The logic ran in the wrong direction. Every shelter the United States added gave the Soviets a reason to add warheads, and every warhead they added gave the United States a reason to pour more concrete. A defense meant to settle the competition threatened instead to feed it. It was the kind of contest in which spending more did not buy more safety, only a larger bill on both sides of the ocean. For the people footing the bill, there was an unease deeper than the size of any number. The whole value of the shell game rested on one secret being kept across an open desert by tens of thousands of workers and crews, year after year, against an adversary watching from orbit. Secrets held by that many people, over that much ground for that long, rarely stay secret. The country was being asked to pay the largest basing bill in its history for a defense its own designers could not promise would work. The land told the same story as the dollars. The shelter system would have spread across an enormous reach of the Great Basin, the high desert that fills much of Nevada and Utah. Contemporary accounts place the footprint somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 square miles, an area roughly the size of the state of Alabama. Across that expanse, the Air Force planned to pour the concrete for 4,600 shelters, grade thousands of miles of road for the transporters to travel, and draw heavily on the one thing the desert has least of, which is water. The water demand frightened the ranchers and farmers of the Great Basin, people who had built their lives on dry land where every drop was already accounted for. The construction would have poured tens of thousands of workers into small desert towns, swelling them well beyond their size for a decade, then pulling out again. The plan asked two of the least populated states in the country to host the largest construction project on the planet, and in doing so, to turn themselves into the most concentrated nuclear target on it. The money would buy a system that demanded an entire region as its foundation. The land would be surrendered for a generation of disruption. The reward at the end of it was the distinction of becoming the first place the Soviet Union would try to destroy. The people who lived on that ground had not been asked whether they wanted any part of it. When their answer finally came, the most powerful voice against the plan rose from a quarter the Air Force had not reckoned with. The word from Salt Lake. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints almost never tells its members how to think about a political question. Through most of its history, the Church had stepped into public debate only on rare occasions, and its leaders protected that restraint with care. So, when the Church's governing council chose to speak about the MX, observers on every side recognized that something out of the ordinary was underway. This was not a body that spoke lightly. The Church had taken a public stand on a contested civic question only a handful of times in living memory, and even then, it chose its moments with great deliberation. Behind the scenes, the decision on the MX had been forming for months. People opposed to the plan had been quietly making their case to church leaders, laying out the costs and the dangers well before any public word was spoken. The ground the Air Force wanted lay at the heart of Mormon country. The Great Basin had been settled by Mormon pioneers in the 19th century, families who walked west to escape persecution and to build what they described as a base from which to carry a message of peace to the world. By 1981, roughly 70% of Utah belonged to the Church, about 1 million people, and the Church's headquarters in Salt Lake City stood only a few hundred miles from where the shelters would be built. The land was not abstract to them. It was the place their ancestors had crossed a continent to reach. On May 5, 1981, the Church's first presidency issued a formal statement. It was signed by the Church president, Spencer Kimball, and his two counselors, N. Eldon Tanner and Marion Romney. The statement ran about 700 words, and it left no room for doubt. The Church opposed basing the missiles in Utah and Nevada. Its reasons came in layers. The system would make the Church's home region one of the first places struck in any nuclear war. The construction would damage the desert's fragile economy and ecology. Beneath those practical objections lay a deeper one, stated plainly. The leaders found a bitter contradiction in the idea that the descendants of pioneers who came west, carrying a gospel of peace, should now be asked to host a weapon they believed could destroy much of civilization. The reaction was swift. Members of the Church make up a large share of the electorate in both Utah and Nevada, and the region's congressional delegation included senators who were themselves members of the Church and firm backers of the military buildup. Utah's two Republican senators, Jake Garn and Orrin Hatch, had spent their careers arguing for a stronger defense and now stood caught between their party's ambitions and the clearly stated position of their own church. Within weeks, the political footing in Utah gave way. The delegation drifted toward opposition, lining up alongside Governor Scott Matheson, alongside the ranchers anxious about their water, alongside the conservation groups anxious about the desert. The statement did not stay within Utah. It was carried by the wire services across the country and read in Washington within the day, and its weight came from its source. This was no protest group and no lone politician. It was the unified voice of the leadership of a church of millions, delivered in a region where that church and the federal government had long kept a careful peace. For a White House counting votes and weighing the politics of the West, a message like that was impossible to set aside. It would be too simple to credit the Church alone with stopping the MX. By several later accounts, President Reagan already held private doubts about the shelter plan and had been hunting for a way out of it before the Church ever spoke a word. The opposition rising in the desert was one pressure among several. The heaviest of those pressures may well have been the price, together with the nagging possibility that the design would not work even if it were built. What the Church's statement accomplished was to strip away the last of the political cover for the plan in the two states that would have to live with it. A scheme that already looked ruinously expensive and possibly unworkable now looked politically impossible besides. There was an irony in it that the era did not miss. The Air Force had chosen the Great Basin in good part Because it was empty, federal land far from the cities, room enough to spread 4,600 shelters across the area of a whole state. That same emptiness was the thing the pioneers had crossed the country to find. The people on that land had gone there to be left alone, and they were in no mood to give it up so that their home could become a bullseye. The statement had been telegraphed straight to the White House. The man who received it had held the presidency only a few months, and he had inherited the entire shelter plan from the administration before his own. Within 5 months, he would step to a podium and begin taking it apart. The October Reversal. A plan that had taken 2 years to assemble and a great deal of money to begin came undone in a single afternoon. On October 2nd, 1981, President Reagan walked into a room of reporters and told them what he meant to do about the MX. By then, the missile was his to manage. Reagan had won the 1980 election partly on a pledge to rebuild American military strength, and during the campaign, he had promised that if he reached the White House, he would cancel the shelter plan. The racetrack, the 4,600 shelters, the shell game spread across the desert, all of it had been chosen by the Carter administration 2 years before he took office. This is the detail the popular memory of the MX tends to lose. The shell game is often remembered as Reagan's because it was fought over and buried during his first year in office. The record runs the other way. Reagan is the president who killed it. He was blunt about the decision. The country, he said, would not deploy the MX in the racetrack shelters proposed by the previous administration, nor in any other scheme of multiple shelters. His plainest words were the ones that stuck in the coverage. "We will not deploy 200 missiles in 4,600 holes." The reasoning he offered was the same one the Budget Office had reached on its own. No matter how many shelters the country built, the Soviets could always build more warheads, more quickly and more cheaply, until the shell game stopped protecting anything at all. What he put forward in place of the desert scheme sounded almost flat after everything that had led up to it. A limited number of MX missiles would go into existing silos, the same sort of fixed, hardened underground silos that already held the older Minuteman force, strengthened as far as the engineers could manage. The military would study 3 longer-range ideas for the future: launching the missiles from aircraft, basing them deep underground, or shielding them with anti-missile defenses, and would pick one by 1984. After a decade of grand schemes, the immediate answer was to tuck the missile into the kind of hole it already had. There was an obvious objection to the interim plan, and Reagan's own people raised it. If fixed silos were too vulnerable to trust with the missile, then putting the new missile into fixed silos solved nothing about the very problem that had started the search. The administration's answer was that the silos were only a temporary home, a place to hold the MX, while the hunt for a survivable basing mode carried on. The hunt would carry on for years. The temporary answer would quietly become the permanent one. In the months that followed, Reagan was careful to cast the program as something larger than any single administration. The planning, he noted, had been carried out under several presidents, and he warned that constant upheaval in a project of this size wasted enormous sums. It was an unusual note of continuity from a man who had campaigned against his predecessor's defense record. It also happened to be true. The missile had been conceived, designed, and paid for across both Republican and Democratic administrations. What changed from one president to the next was only the answer to the basing question, and that answer kept circling back toward the same fixed silos the whole effort had set out to leave behind. The politics of it all hung unspoken in the room until a reporter said them out loud. He asked the president directly whether the real reasons behind the decision were 2 things the White House would never volunteer. Had Reagan refused to even consider the racetrack because Jimmy Carter had proposed it? And was he keeping the missiles out of Utah and Nevada because of the opposition from the Mormon Church and from his friend Senator Paul Laxalt of Nevada? The exchange sits in the official transcript to this day, asked and preserved. Whatever weight each factor actually carried, the question made one thing clear. Everyone in that room understood the decision had not been reached on engineering grounds alone. Somewhere inside that announcement, the machine was set aside for good. The 180-foot transporter, the remote-controlled hauler built to carry a hydrogen bomb in circles around a desert racetrack, would never be produced in any number. The roads it was meant to travel were never graded. The 4,600 shelters were never poured. The most elaborate basing scheme the Pentagon had ever drawn up was abandoned before 1 mile of its private desert highway was ever laid down. Yet canceling the shell game did nothing to cancel the missile. The MX was still coming. It was still funded, still in production, still scheduled to join the force. It still had to be put somewhere. The place it finally went was the one place the entire shell game had been invented to avoid. What replaced the shell game took 3 more years of argument to settle, and the answer the country arrived at was an ordinary one. Reagan first tried a scheme called dense pack, which proposed clustering the missiles so tightly together that incoming Soviet warheads would knock one another off course before they could all strike home. Congress examined the idea and rejected it at the end of 1982. The president then turned to a bipartisan commission led by Brent Scowcroft, and in the spring of 1983, the commission delivered its recommendation. After more than a decade of imagining racetracks and transporters and missiles hidden in a desert shell game, the experts advised putting the MX into the Minuteman silos already standing in the northern plains. Congress fought the deployment at every turn. Lawmakers cut the planned force from 200 missiles to 100, and then, in 1985, capped it at 50 until the administration could produce a basing scheme that would actually survive a strike. The Air Force never found one that Congress was willing to buy. Between 1986 and 1988, 50 MX missiles, renamed the Peacekeeper by then, were lowered into reworked Minuteman silos at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. The shape of the outcome is worth sitting with. The MX had been conceived in the first place because fixed silos at known locations were judged too vulnerable to survive a Soviet first strike. The entire shell game, the 4,600 shelters, the transporters, the racetracks, the tens of billions of estimated dollars, every piece of it existed for one purpose: to get the missile out of a fixed silo at a known location. After more than 10 years of study and a fortune in development, the missile went into a fixed silo at a known location. Only a quarter of the planned force was ever built. The shell game that had alarmed 2 states and drawn a rare rebuke from a church was never constructed at all. The numbers carry the rest of the story. 200 missiles had been planned and 50 were fielded. 4,600 shelters had been drawn and none were built. A system priced at one point as high as $106 billion ended as 50 missiles tucked into silos that had been in the ground since the 1960s. The most expensive part of the whole affair, in the end, was the decade the country spent trying to avoid the answer it had started with. The country did keep trying to make the Peacekeeper move for a few more years. In 1986, Reagan approved a plan to mount 50 of the missiles on special trains, 25 of them, 2 missiles to a train, that would roll out of their garrisons and scatter across the national rail network in a crisis. The trains were designed, and the program reached full development. President Bush canceled it in 1991 as the Cold War drew to a close, and the rail garrison went the way of the racetrack before it. The 50 Peacekeepers stood in their Wyoming silos until 2005, when the last of them was withdrawn under an arms control treaty signed with the very country they had been built to deter. As for the machine, the 180-foot transporter, built to crawl the desert and work the shell game, almost none were ever made. The racetracks it was designed for were never cut into the ground. The mover that gave this whole episode its peculiar shape had nowhere to go because the burrows it was meant to travel between were never dug. What remains of the shell game is mostly what was never built. The 4,600 shelters were never poured. The private roads across Nevada and Utah were never graded. The Great Basin, the stretch of desert the Air Force once measured against the size of Alabama, was left to the ranchers and the sagebrush, much as it had been before the surveyors came. The 2 states that organized against the plan went back to their quiet. One piece of the machine survived. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a Peacekeeper missile stands on display, and near it rests one of the carriers built to move the weapon between the shelters that were never dug. It is the closest thing the shell game ever produced to a finished article. A single mover for a journey it never made, parked indoors a long way from the desert it was designed to cross. The missile it was meant to hide spent its entire service standing still in a fixed silo at a known address in Wyoming. The exact arrangement, the whole elaborate plan had been built to escape. The country had set out to find a place to put a missile where no enemy could ever locate it. After more than 10 years, 4,600 imagined shelters, and a price that began at $33 billion, the place it chose was the one where the missiles had been standing all along.